Tēnā koutou katoa, kia kapi ki te kātou, whakapapa ki te uru, whakapapa te hautu ki te tonga, kia māki ne ina, te ita, kia mātaratara ki tai, kia hi, and te rana, te kātakura, te tio, te huka, te kauhu, te hei, no ura. Nau mai, haere mai, kia kami ki te VTO, kia Pākehā au, koke tōku ingo, and I use she, her pronouns. I'd like to acknowledge the mana whenua of this place, Ngā Rangatira, Te Aotearoa, and Taranaki whānui, and I'm here representing Justice for Palestine. Tonight's panel is a collaboration with the Wellington Socialist Society, and I'd like to give particular thanks to Hayden and to Angus for working on setting up. Thank you also to Bedlam and Swallow for hosting us this evening. Very briefly, we have whakapapa down and to the right after the bar. Our exit is exactly the way you entered, so everybody knows what that is. And I'd like to just give a brief sort of introduction and context for why we're here tonight. Our panel is going to discuss the experience of Indigenous resistance in both Aotearoa and Palestine. I'm really grateful for their generosity of our speakers and as they share their reflections this evening. The myth of benevolent colonization continues to be grasped like a life raft in Aotearoa by many people. For Pākehā in particular, opportunities to hear about the common international tools of settler colonization are urgent insights into the realities of the violence of the colonization of this family. The horrors of the Zionist project that exemplify frontier colonization shatter the mythology of benevolent New Zealand colonization. The impacts experienced by Tangata whenua today, they illustrate that even as frontier colonization changes to systemic colonization, the inequality and oppression is disastrous. Today I joined Ngā Puhi rallying today outside Parliament. It was a rally against the repeal of Article 7AA from the Oranga Tamariki Act. Last week we had the release of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care. There is also the move to disestablish Māori wards, the only wards to be reviewed or removed. And all of these violent state actions against Māori are examples of institutional colonization. They occur because the frontier violence of settler colonization that paved the way for what we have here in Aotearoa today. And what we see in Gaza is directly related to what continues to occur here. It is deeply relevant to all of us due to our common humanity, and it is relevant due to our common colonial structures. We must pay attention and we must act. Oppression benefits from and is protected by division. So international solidarity and resistance is part of the solution to the problem of settler colonization. Tonight, I invite you to join me in listening to discussions that dismantle the mythologies constructed to oppress and that exemplify unity in the face of division. With these understandings, I challenge those, in particular those who share my whakapapa, to actively work against these systemic and colonial injustices. So this evening, our panel will be moderated by Faisal Al-Assad, a writer and teaching fellow at Te Hereranga Waka, Victoria University, who is committed to a critique of settler colonialism and imperialism from within a Marxist tradition of thought. And the panel itself consists of Nico Whenua and Sumaya Daoud and Ellie Young. And we may be joined also online by Lujane Hamza, who is currently in Wales, and we are hoping that she will make it, but you know, there's a long way to come. We'll be projecting her up here if she does arrive. So thank you for being here. Thank you, panelists, for sharing what you have experienced. And with appreciation, I hand over to Faisal. Modiora.
Kia ora, everyone. First of all, you lot back there are being ridiculous, so can I just get you to come forward? Aya, Sasha, Hannah, Layla, I'm going to name you. There's heaps of seats here. I don't want to use the mic, so thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the organizers, all of you who are here and thereabouts, and who are not present. Thank you to Bellum as well for hosting us. Thank you to my friends and presenters up here. And thank you all for coming here to participate in this discussion. Of course, glory and greetings to all the Palestinian martyrs and resistance fighters, many of whom were killed and assassinated in the past 2 weeks. And right now, Palestinians in the occupied territories are in a state of both uproar and mourning and in grief. So I'm just recognizing that to begin. My role going forward is very, very minimal. I don't know what moderating is. I was just asked to do it, and here I am. So I'm just going to play it by ear. I'm even going to let them introduce themselves. So that's pretty much it from me. The thing I will say, however, is that just to speak to what I think of this panel and the idea of Indigenous solidarity is just one quick panel. For a long time, participating in these things, I have often felt that and observed, rightly or wrongly, and I hope I'll be convinced otherwise as we go forward, but that Indigenous solidarity, especially here and in other places in the Western world, is kind of not taken very seriously. And I don't mean that as in to say that people don't care about it, that they don't think about it, that they don't feel strongly about it. My problem with it is, with these spaces, and often progressive spaces, is that Indigenous solidarity is treated as a kind of moral thing. And that's important, but it's insufficient in and of itself. I think this is the time, if ever there was a time, to really take seriously the political content of Indigenous solidarity as a space of politics, as a space of critique. For example, for myself, and I'm just speaking for myself, I'm not totally convinced that indigeneity or Indigenous solidarity itself is a neutral, self-evident, trans-historical category for political work. That's something that we have to prove and that we have to do together, and it depends on us. So that is what I hope this panel and this space could be about, the real political content and substance of Indigenous solidarity. With that out of the way, and towards more technical but equally important matters, the way this is going to go is I'm going to pass it over to the speakers, and they'll have 10 minutes each to take us through what they deem to be questions of political and historical significance for us at this historical juncture. And it is such an important historical juncture. And then towards the end, we'll kind of bring it back towards a more group discussion, and we'll hopefully tease out and maybe challenge each other a bit on some of the things that we bring to the space and some of the things that we take for granted in the space as a way of moving forward. Just one last question. Any word from the Jane?
No, no.
Okay. All right, without further ado, I'll pass it to our first speaker, Nico.
Tēnā ora tātou, mērā kia koutou, kia mai, tau nei. Kia horo ai te kōrero ki kaupapa Taina, o Aotearoa anō ki Anthony kia koutou, tēnā koutou. Kia ora everybody, my name is Nico Whenua. I'm the Wellington City Councillor I am a student of Faisal, and amongst other things, a aspiring scholar of indigeneity, and an ever-learning one at that, as I think we all probably are. So, firstly, I'd like to issue a disclaimer, which is that I didn't realise I would be talking for 10 minutes. So there might be some indulgences that I would have to beg from the crowd. But I do have a topic. And my contribution tonight, I think, will be around the idea of history, of historicity, if you will, and its role in shaping narratives with regard to treaties, narratives with regards to Indigenous solidarity and sovereignty, ultimately. So the first thing I want to talk about is the here and now. So it's 2024, obviously. We exist in a particular moment in history where it feels as if indigeneity is under attack from a lot of different angles. Over the seas, it's under attack through rifles and tanks and missiles. Over here, it's under attack through legislation and speech and policy. What I think is very important to understand is that though one isn't necessarily a logical endpoint to the other, they both exist on a continuum which has been inherited from many, many, many decades of colonial oppression. So, the first thing I want to talk about is what sovereignty is, because for colonialism to take place, there has to necessarily be an undermining of sovereignty. So, sovereignty in this country, the first conceptions of it would have been conceived by Māori to exist at the hapu level. For those who are not familiar, a hapu is commonly translated in English as a sub-tribe, bigger than a whānau, bigger than a family, smaller than an iwi. And everyone within a hapu would hold varying levels of seniority based on their descendants from a single eponymous ancestor. So if you're Ngāti Huia, for example, everyone in your hapu descends from one person, usually a man but not always, called Huia, or Te Huia. This was the primary unit of political organisation in Māori society, and hapu were considered to have aika, or home fires, over a particular area which they continuously inhabited. And though the boundaries of that area were reinforced orally, they were reinforced through action, through gathering, through customary practice, and they were recognised by the neighbours of that hapu, who in turn had their own zones of sovereignty. Now, throughout the colonisation process, from the 19th century through to the early 20th, there was a systematic undermining of hapu sovereignty. It happened first in what were to become the urban regions of this country, particularly Port Nicholson, or Whenua here in London, also up north, the Far North in particular, and then subsequently the South Island. The greatest shift that Māori political society underwent throughout this period of colonisation was the deliberate disempowering of hapu in favour of iwi. And what we've seen in the late 20th century and now the 21st century is a systematic disempowering of iwi in favour of post-settlement governance entities. So that's the thing that your iwi becomes once you get the treaty settlement from the Crown. You have to make one, there are no two ways about it. You have to set up a little corporation, Crown gives you money, etc. So the point I'm making here is that throughout our history leading up to this moment, Māori have understood sovereignty in a variety of sort of different ways, and those ways have been shaped by the colonial project, and we now lack a language to articulate sovereignty that can be separated from what we are currently experiencing as a very sort of corporate, hand-wavy Māori way. History didn't start yesterday, it didn't start last month, it didn't start last year, particularly didn't start on October 7th. And my point tonight is really that people will talk about things like those issues that Faisal raised before, of Māori wards, of 7AA, of all of those contemporary flashpoints of policy and legislative pain for Tangata in this country, as if they're happening in a vacuum. And the point I'm trying to make is that just like the genocide occurring over the seas right now did not happen overnight, and there is a long history of policy and decision making that happened to lead to this point. Neither did it happen overnight. And so what I guess my encouragement to everyone this evening will be is to recall the whakapapa of the crises that we find ourselves in. Recall the policy points and the individual decisions which led us here. There are many, 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 there are lots of different groups, but when you start looking at it historically, you can actually begin to trace the genealogy of these things in quite a logical way. You know, humans as actors, as agents, tend to act with predictable interests in mind. People don't usually do things just for the heck of it. There is usually a reason for the ways that people act, and this can be generalized to groups. And the horrors which we witness as part of the colonial project here and overseas may seem so inexplicable, so alien almost, but I think it is by putting them within historical context that you can begin to unpick the logic which underpins them, and you can begin to grapple with what specifically needs to be dismantled to prevent them from continuing. I think that's probably a pretty good start. I wasn't timing that, so I might pass over to Ella now, but that's probably a little taste of what I'm going to talk about. Ella.
Te reo mihi o taku tungane konei, ai, kia koutou whātai mai te tēnei ko, aha ko te makariri, aha ko te aha kei konei tātai katoa. Welcome everyone. I'd just like to echo Nico's words of mihi to you all and for making it out here despite the cold. Ko ela tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no te Aotearoa, te ngai tahu hoki, ki te waka o Māui. Recently found out about that whakapapa, so that was cool. It happens, yeah, exactly. But I think I'm going to take, I don't know, I'm not much of an academic, so I think like the kōrero that I'm going to share tonight draws from my experiences of what makes Indigenous resistance and drawing from my personal experiences of that. So I grew up in Palestine, or for a section of my childhood. My dad used to work for the UN, and that exposure, I guess, to Palestinian identity and Palestinian resistance was something I understood before I understood what it meant to be Māori. That was something that I could connect with before we kind of engaged with our iwi and went down that whole journey. And my dear friend Nadia Agushana talks about learning a lot about what it means to be Indigenous from Māori, and I feel like I learned a lot about what it meant to be Indigenous from Palestinians. So I think for me tonight, that's what I can share and offer is what I observed and what I learned, and I guess what I now know to be some of the crucial ingredients of Indigenous resistance and what makes our resistance so unique. So I think, I'm just going to be Gen Z and put my phone on the table. Very broadly, the struggle of Māori here in Aotearoa and the struggle of Palestinians is against settler colonialism. Those projects, for the sake of terminology, operate the same way, incredibly different motivations, some very similar motivations, and kind of outwork in different times and different spaces with different levels of technology and so different consequences. But the settler colonial project is the same project. And so when we engage in resistance, in my kind of view, we're engaging in decolonisation. And that's a word that's thrown around a lot. And I think I would like to draw on, and I'm going to draw on Whenua Jackson's kōrero a few times tonight, but he talks about decolonisation as the epic of restoration. So we're not just, pulling apart colonial entities, structures, thoughts, ways of being, we're also restoring Indigenous ways of being. So it's not just a lack of settler colonialism, but a restoration of our own identities and ways of being. I think that's really important. So with kind of that outline in mind, the kind of three things I want to touch on tonight is the idea of bravery and courage, the cost that comes from that, and the opportunity for us. So, back to Whenua Jackson. He has this beautiful quote. For those of you who don't know him, Whenua passed away just over 2 years ago, I think, in April 2022. And I kind of have a legal background, and for Māori in the legal sphere, he was just our most beautiful and inspiring leader. And he's been like a prophet, I think, for Aotearoa and for the direction we should be going. So if you haven't heard of him or heard of his work, you should definitely go and engage in that after tonight. But he said this beautiful quote, that is, if there is anything that has marked the survival of our people and the flourishing of our people, it is that we have been brave. And I thought about the experiences I witnessed firsthand and also just generally Palestinians go through, and the choices that Palestinians have made in the way they resist. And I think it's totally speaks to that same sentiment that Matua Moana is getting at when he talks about the bravery and courage that Māori have shown historically and currently here in order to kind of progress this epic of restoration. And I'm going to talk on a few stories about people that I know and their lives, and how that kind of epic of bravery, or that bravery and courage has contributed to the survival of their people. So we have some beautiful friends in the West Bank called the Nasa whānau, and they live between Hebron and Bethlehem, if you know the West Bank. And they have a block of land that they call the Tent of Nations. Some of you may have heard of it. And they are one of the only hilltops, if you stand on their farm and look around in a 360, that is Palestinian land still. There are settlers on every single hillside surrounding their farm. They can't live on their land because they don't have access to water. They don't have a whole bunch of basic necessities. They're in 20 years plus worth of legal battles. They rely really heavily on international aid and support from donors to pay their legal fees, because their lifestyle is so expensive because of the choke of the Israeli state. And we got to spend time with them and live with them and share food with them and exist on their land with them. And the grit, determination and bravery of that family to get up every day and fight tooth and nail for their whenua has produced this beautiful fruit of retaining land, which is something that I think all Indigenous people can understand is like this core, intimately part of who we are kind of value that must exist alongside us. My whānau, when we lived in East Jerusalem, one day went down to Sheikh Jarrah. You've probably also heard of Sheikh Jarrah, it's in the media a lot, because a family down there had been removed from their home forcibly, and they were sitting on the side of the road with all of their belongings next to the fence of their house. And my mum said that we were going to bake them muffins and go down and sit with them, because, you know, she's Pākehā, so that's what she does. So we baked these muffins. I don't know if they had muffins before, I don't know if that's a thing in Palestine, but we took our muffins down and sat with them, and as we sat there, in a space where they welcomed us so beautifully, on the side of the road outside their home, one of the old pui from that whānau got up onto a plastic garden chair next to the fence and filled up a watering can and started to water her trees on the other side of the fence in her house. And sitting there and experiencing what that must have taken for her to sit outside her home while other people lived in it the most violently unjust, sickening way, and choose to water her trees. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't making a scene, she was just actively engaging in this beautiful and restorative action that connected her back to her land, and in that moment kind of was this really just action. And I think that also just speaks to the incredible bravery and courage that Indigenous peoples consistently show in the way that they resist. And I think bringing it here to my story, I'm a descendant of Ngāti Te Whiti o Rongomai from Parihaka, and we have ploughshares in our line of whakapapa who tilled the land day after day as the settler forces put in the survey pegs to mark out the land essentially that was being taken and mapped out for the Pākehā. And you know, that courage and bravery to get up every single morning and engage in this kind of, on paper, fruitless act of connecting with the land and doing what you know is right and getting on with your business as usual in the face of this colonial violence, I think again to me just speaks to this incredible bravery of Indigenous peoples in the way that they resist. And I feel like I can connect that to my own story and the way that we resist now, because that very court building that my ancestor Te Kitioroma Mai was sentenced in and spoke his defence in Te Reo Māori, and I got to stand up in last year and speak Te Reo Māori in a court hearing. And that's a language that I've had to relearn. And that was the first time in my line of whakapapa in 5 generations that someone got up and spoke Te Reo Māori that fluently in a setting where it wasn't required. But choosing to do that and undo some of that trauma required so much bravery, because let me tell you, I'm not the most fluent Te Reo Māori speaker. So I think there's kind of these threads that weave themselves through our stories that just so demonstrate the intense bravery and courage of Indigenous struggle. Where this is not just a happy story is when we start to think about and reflect on the cost of that bravery. For our friends in the West Bank, the Nassau family, the money, the time, the energy, the loss of input into their careers, time with their family, relationships with their local community, stress, violence, constant struggle are all costs that they pay by the brave act of resistance that they undertake by protecting their land. And I think it's easy to, you know, talk about these beautiful stories as these wonderful experiences where we can all say, wow, how wonderful Indigenous people, this is so great. But there is a huge cost to Indigenous bravery. And for that family, that is what it looks like. I mean, I could go on about the atrocities that they have faced, but I think you can all maybe guess, knowing what the Zionist Project does to Palestinians and to resist. In Sheikh Jarrah, when this grandmother was reaching over the fence to water her trees, a mob of Israeli settlers and IDF soldiers walked down the hill towards us as we were sat there, and one of the men pushed her off the chair that she was standing on as she was watering the plants. And so her whānau and a lot of the young men in her whānau ran to her support and were defending her from these soldiers, and they got arrested. And so when we talk about this bravery and beautiful act of resistance by watering her trees, there was a cost. There was a cost to them being dragged out of their home and the fact that they lost their home. And there was a cost to her even choosing to still engage with her whenua in the way that she should be able to, because her whānau subsequently got arrested. And that's the kind of cost that I think we have to keep bringing to the forefront and naming what does it take, you know, for Indigenous people to be brave. And for those in my whakapapa at Parihaka, they were unjustly imprisoned, they lost land, they experienced extreme violence in all forms, and it wasn't something that could just kind of like slip through the cracks and go away unnoticed. It was a trigger for a whole bunch of loss and cost. And so I think why I'm talking about this bravery and the cost is wanting everyone in this room, especially if you're not Indigenous or you don't come from a colonial struggle, to understand what the opportunity is here for you. Because we need you to show the bravery and we need you to bear the cost. Because the cost is higher for us and the bravery is harder for us. And it's not something we get to opt in and opt out of, because our entire identity is at threat all the time. And when we talk about this and, you know, the kind of modern warfare conceptions of colonial violence that we're seeing today, we can see it in the very much warfare violence that we're seeing in Palestine. And if you are not Indigenous, what are you doing to be brave and getting out of your comfort zone, because it's not comfortable being Indigenous and resisting? And what are you doing to join us in bearing the cost of Indigenous resistance? So that's kind of like the message I would like to leave you with and ponder on. It's maybe less like academically, historically, politically poised than some of the other cordial tonight, but I think it's maybe the framework in which we need to hold this discussion in, because I think this is the context in which it sits. Tēnā whātau.
So I'm same as Ella. I will just share my experience as a third-generation refugee from Palestine. So my family are from Whenua, don't know from me, but I lived my whole life in the West Bank, in Ramallah, and I studied in a Palestinian school and graduated also from Gaza University in the West Bank. And this is why I choose to talk about education as a form of resistance. I will start talking about why education is so important for Palestinians and why Palestine continues to have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. So, historically, education was always important for Palestinians. However, the most significant shift actually came after the Nakba. So try to think of yourself as a refugee under occupation, and at any moment you might lose your job, your money, your house, your family, your land. This is why Palestinians from our background, because of the Nakba and the national trauma, education was the only asset to survive. In case any of these things happened. I remember growing up hearing things from my parents, my teacher, that the only thing that you can take with you anywhere is, in case you lost everything, is your degree, your education, and what did you learn. This is what will save you. So this is the kind of mindset that we have in Palestine. So for us, education is more as a survival tool than just an opportunity or a better quality of life. Secondly, I want just to let you know a little bit about the education system in Palestine. So I will only talk about the West Bank and Gaza. In Palestine and Gaza, we have three, like mix of three kind of school, like private, public, and Aotearoa. Aotearoa is the UN schools for students who are refugees from historical Palestine. And for my experience, my early schooling was in private. Then in primary, I studied in Aotearoa school, and ended my secondary education in a public school. The second part is how can we call cultural systems? Like how Palestinian really resist through education? To answer this, I will share with you some of the challenges that me and my family went through, and some of my other friends as well in the West Bank. My sister, she used to study in a university called Oates University in Abu Dhabi. And because the campus was divided by the apartheid separation wall, and due to being nearby settlements and military presence, the uni faces regular illegal campus raids and tear gas attacks, like on a daily basis. And because of the restricted movement in the West Bank and the checkpoints, my sister used to take an hours for her to arrive to the campus, even though if there's no checkpoint, it will take only like 15 minutes. So she used to leave the house like 2 hours earlier just for the checkpoints, so she can go to the campus and go to her lectures. Another challenge that students in Palestine go through is the administrative detention, which is basically an Israeli practice of holding Palestinians indefinitely without a charge or a trial. And if you don't know, Israel is the only country that arrests children. So I remember my brother shared with me a story. Before he came to New Zealand, He studied in 3 schools when he was in intermediate, and in the 3 schools he witnessed the IOF invading his school and arresting other students. And also, I studied in these universities, and a number of my friends and students, and also staff at the uni, have been arrested. I want to share with you some of the names of my colleagues who have been arrested recently. So, Amal Shajaiya and Maith al-Kishi, Basim Saloom, Abdullah Barouthi, Muhammad Adnan, Layani Kaid, Shahid Aweda, and also Hadid Muhammad, a staff member at the Zayn. So some of these students were arrested before as an administrative detention as well, and they recently, after October 7, they arrested them for the same thing, like for no child reason. As we talk about prisons, Palestinian prisoners as well continue their education even inside prison. If the prison allowed it though. So I want to share with you a story of one of my friends. Her name is Maisa Balosh. She was arrested in 2019 and she was student at visit. So there's a time where Israel was prisoning a lot of students from Visa Uni. So Nice ended up with another student, female student at the prison. And they decided together to organize and make like a daily schedule for certain readings and to teach each other. So they would be participate in education even if they are inside prison. But I would like to tell you that at the moment, like after 2007, Ben Ghafir is not allowing this anymore. So Israeli prisons known for the torturing of Palestinians in prisons and also the medical neglection and starvation. But the starvation and all the other stuff are really on a higher level now. It's like even much worse than before after 2007. So all these stuff are not allowed anymore and the conditions are much worse. Finally, I would talk about education as a form of resistance in Gaza. I don't live in Gaza, but I also I lived in Palestine, so I know some of things living there. So I remember that each year, the first in the country in Palestine are always students from Gaza in the high school exams. I also know that in Gaza, they have one of the highest percentage of people with PhDs. And as we know, since the genocide, Israel continued to target schools and education institutions. But I believe it's not only to ensure a high civilian death toll, but also to continue to eradicate the vital infrastructure needed within Gaza to resume basic human life when the genocide stops. Because Israel knows how we Palestinians look at education and how is it the only or the last survival tool for us that we depend on. And actually, even in all the past Israeli attacks and wars in Gaza, schools were always targeted, as seen as in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2019, and 2021, and the current genocide. And even though in all these wars, schools were bombed, teachers were killed, lots of students were killed, but then each year, a student from Gaza comes through with the highest scores first in the country in every branch of Palestine. And for the first time, students in Gaza did not take this year's final exam, which is a big deal for us Palestinians. So Israel continued, or education system actually has been systematically wiped out by Israel. And despite that, recently the Islamic Uni in Gaza has resumed online teaching, even though the uni being completely collapsed. No uni actually left in Gaza, all the unis been bombed, but recently the Islamic uni has resumed online teaching, and lots of students actually did enroll in this program. And there is as well another initiative by the university called the Building Home, and they help students to complete their uni education online. And lots of Gaza, despite the displacement and the genocide, they did apply for this program. And I don't know if you heard about the walking school. So lots of teachers in the refugee camp now are doing like a walking schooling for children. And when there's and they move from a camp to another. And some other organization like Qattan, for example, some of the workers are local from Gaza, and they do some activities, education and entertainment for children. So even though the situation is really hard now, but they're finding their way to resist and through education. So yeah, this is all.
Thank you, all three of you, for individually and collectively what you I think I'm speaking for probably when I say that it's not only challenging, I guess analytically, but also really moving to listen to the recording, and most of all, the stories that we shared just now. So, what I might do now is we have just over an hour left, and I want everyone here, speakers and participants, to take part in the discussion. But I'd also like to be a little bit selfish and take a bit of space to ask you some questions that I have. And they're going to touch on some of the things that you brought up, and some of the maybe links and connections that I have humbly made between some of the things that you've said. And then after that, I'll just kind of open it up for everyone to take part in the discussion. Bye-bye. Okay, so the first thing that struck me that Nico, you named quite explicitly as sovereignty, and the question of sovereignty, which is indigenous sovereignty, is something that is being attacked on a global, international scale, and a concomitant one as well, and one that's always been at the heart of struggles historically in the colonial context. I'd like us to maybe dwell with that a bit and think about sovereignty. What does that entail? What does that mean in different contexts? What does the struggle over that look like? How do those struggles connect between different contexts? And specifically Aotearoa and Palestine. And I'd also like to maybe ask about the scales of sovereignty. I hear as a higher tier of sovereignty in terms of state sovereignty, and the struggles over that, as we're seeing right now in Aotearoa. But I also hear a bit about sovereignty and what you said about the decisions that people have to make on a daily basis about what costs they'll pay for their actions and the consequences that they'll bear. So yeah. I'll leave it.
I have a go. Try to get into it. So I guess if we're going to pick at the sovereignty thread, the first thing I will do is share a very well-loved and well-shared quote by, I think, Ursula Le Guin, which is that she writes, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than making it capitalism." I'm sure you've all heard it. I'm sure you've all heard Green Party functionaries saying it. It happens. But I also want to pull in another quote, and this is after all the Socialist Society, so I'm going to invoke old Grandad Lenin, who said that colonialism is the highest form, imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. And I want to explore how those two quotes interact with specific regard to sovereignty. So, whilst the power of colonial capitalism in Aotearoa and in Palestine and elsewhere, in Australia and the colonised Americas, everywhere in the Pacific, everywhere, free Hawaii, it seems as if the hegemonic power of capitalism is totally unable to be challenged. It suffuses every part of our lives. It is our wages that we get on a Wednesday afternoon. It is the $120 we pay for, our meal on our cooking night at our student flat. It is every part of our existence. It is the 1-hour meetings that we make in our Outlook calendar to meet with friends and acquaintances instead of just walking over to their house. But what is unique about the anti-colonial struggle, if indeed, if Grandad Lenin is right, and if indeed imperialism and subsequently settler colonialism is in fact the highest capitalism and is required to extract resources and send them back to the imperial core in the finance centres of London and Wall Street, etc. If that is the case, then the most serious ontological challenge to the supremacy of capitalism comes through anti-colonialism. What I mean by that is, if we can use anti-colonialism to imagine a world apart from capitalism, to meaningfully embrace indigenous values in whatever locale, whatever part of the empire we live, if we can in this country embrace Te Ao Māori, if we can in Palestine embrace Palestinian ways of living, not Zionist or sort of puppet United States settler ways of living. If we can meaningfully articulate what it would be like to conduct the whole courses of our lives in relations to one another differently, then that is the most meaningful and significant ontological challenge that we can pose to the supremacy of capitalism and imperialism. And what we do when we do that is we build a dual power. We build a meaningful challenge and a meaningful alternative through which services can be delivered, through which policy can be made, through which people can be uplifted, and the material conditions of our neighbourhoods and our suburbs and societies and our cities can eventually be uplifted and delivered in such a way that presents a challenge to the way that capitalism delivers these services currently. So I guess my point is, sovereignty doesn't have to look like a state. It can look like what one of my favourite academics at the moment, Audra Simpson, calls peoplehood instead of nationhood. And what I like about peoplehood is that it centres relations with one another. It is abstracted from questions of authority and legitimacy by legislation, and abstracted particularly from the colonial project. What peoplehood says to me is, as a way that Indigenous people have conducted their lives and lived their societies for since time immemorial, as the Native Americans say, is it says that another life is possible, basically. And so if we can build peoplehood other to capitalism, then I think that is our most meaningful assertion of sovereignty and our most meaningful challenge to the hegemonic systems which place so many of our people here and across the seas under such terrible oppression.
Yeah, I think for me sovereignty is key, right? That's not a negotiable part of the conversation around the ethic of restoration or decolonisation, whatever we want to term it. And I think it's really indigeneity and Indigenous values, and I think I can actually broadly say that because we see so much of ourselves in other Indigenous people and so much of our value in other cultures, is that antidote to so much of what our world is suffering with at the moment. And I think it's an antidote to capitalism. I think it's an antidote to loneliness. We know how to do community. It's an antidote to distrust when you are living communally with people, and suspicion and fear. It's an antidote to low self-esteem when people don't know where they belong in a society, because the way Indigenous groups are structured, everyone's strengths have a space to belong and sit. And so I think if we continue to rebuild and re-indigenize, we will see so much benefit in our world for everyone. And we talk about that, right? Like here in Aotearoa, what's good for Māori is good for everyone. And they strongly believe that. Because we know this land and we know how to do life here in a way that's so much more holistically good and like correct and tika and balanced and appropriate than colonisers do. And that's the gift that Indigenous peoples have to offer the world, is like balance, restoration. Environmental degradation is a massive issue. Like 98% or some stat like that of like land that's in, you know, really healthy condition and biodiversity strong is in the hands of Indigenous peoples. So we know like indigeneity is the answer to so many of our problems and Indigenous values, and we will not see the benefit of those things if we don't have Indigenous sovereignty. And I think there's that aspect, and that's almost capitalist in itself, right? Is how does everyone else benefit off Indigenous peoples and like their good values? And that's one way of looking at it. But I think the other part of it is just justice, right? And we can talk about like UNDRIP, and we can talk about all these different mechanisms that say in Pākehā law, Indigenous people have the right to self-determination, blah, blah, blah. But actually, it is unjust to force a group of people to conform themselves, to assimilate themselves into a different way of being, and not say you have the right to determine how you live your life and how you carry yourselves, and that those values and reo and ways of being that have passed down from your ancestors, which in our case is the mountains and the water and the land and the seas, those things that they have taught you, you can hold those because they are true and valid. And if we don't have that, we've lost something devastating. So I guess that's the way I see sovereignty and the role that sovereignty has to play in all of this, is it's everything. Because if we are not sovereign, we're not ourselves. And I think that's really huge. So.
Okay, so I'll just say about one thing that Ella did say. I remember she was talking about the farmers and how the Indigenous know how to deal with their lands. I remember in Palestine, with lots of settlers from other countries to Palestine, how did they bring other plants that don't so like suit Palestine environment, which lead to lots of problems now in Palestine. So yeah, this is why we have to share.
To follow up on some of those points and to connect to another really important point that, well, in my opinion, that came up was the question of bravery. And to some extent, I think that, at least from where I'm standing, that goes to the heart of sovereignty. The ability to make certain decisions. And there's, like Nico, you alluded to it on the level of political decision making. We also have the kind of sovereignty that people practice when in relation to their neighbors, and your story, Allah. And then we had October 7th, when a certain gamble was taken by the Hamas resistance to say that we're going to make this decision and we're going to bear the costs that come with that. And those costs are the costs we bear for the decision to crack open history. So to kind of follow through on that, what creates a vacuum for bravery? How is it? This is something that I think we can all relate to. I think about it in an academic context. I think about it in a workplace context. How does it get to a point where people are unable to practice that decision-making, to practice their historical and political agency, and how do we remedy that? Indigeneity is one antidote, Allah. But also, I'd like to kind of, I guess, challenge us to think a bit more closely about that, and especially not just in our context, but in relation to Palestine as well, and internationally.
Well, I think that for Indigenous peoples, it's not a choice. There's no vacuum. It just, I mean, from the beginning of the settler colonial project, thus began bravery. And if you think about the stories that Sumaya was sharing about her sister, right, and going to university and waiting for 2 hours, and like we've seen that, you know, lines of Palestinians outside a checkpoint waiting to study, and how vitally important that degree is for her identity, and for her resistance and future, and that she would do that. And that's like on paper not necessarily something that would like make a good movie and be like, wow, how brave, this is an incredible like superhero story, but it's constant, it's like relentless, you know? You can't exist with, like, existence is resistance, you know, it's that whole idea of like doing anything, going about any of your day-to-days in an Indigenous way, like being yourself, is incredibly brave. So I think actually, for me, I've put that question to people who are not Indigenous, to say what's going to take for you, because I don't think it's something that Indigenous peoples can opt out of if we want to survive. It is not a choice, it's a necessity, and that's what your friends and yourself and your family experience, you know, around education, and we can look at it around farming and land, you know, all these different spheres, but as long as that project exists, vacuum is created, and that's not an opt-in, opt-out thing. And so I think for people who are not, yeah, is it a death toll number? Is it this many atrocities? Is it how many cases of polio in Gaza? Is it 7AA? I don't know, but I think that's something that individually we have to wrestle with, is what's it going to take to step up and mirror the level of Indigenous bravery that we see all the time. Because Ngāpuhi didn't have a choice coming down here this week. That's not an option, because it's their babies that are being held by the state. And so I think it's just this, it's not even a juggle, it's just like, we wake up and we do what we can every single day. And yeah, like I say, for those who aren't Indigenous, the question is back on you. You know, what's it going to take?
I can upload them briefly. I think the point about existing in an Indigenous way being in itself resistance is a really good one. And I think two experiences that I had that really brought this home for me in an international context actually came from Samira. So for those of you who don't know, as of late last year, Wellington is now sister cities with Ramallah, which is a city in the West Bank, which was quite a challenging and a painful but also a very beautiful process that we undertook last year at the City Council, and it has resulted already in a lot of really incredible learning and growth for us, and hopefully in the future it can be an even stronger relationship. But the thing that I really want to talk about and offer again to Samira and JFP in general about is the way that it was presented on the day of the vote. So picture this, we were there, we were in the council chamber, some of you may have been there, if you were, thank you very much. And we had the usuals, we had Zionist pastors who had driven down from Auckland to spew this very hateful, ugly rhetoric. We had people who were saying it wasn't our business. We had some just out-and-out racists, I would say, in the chamber. And then we had some very sort of brave, but also quiet members of our Palestinian community in Wellington who spoke up and spoke their truth at the same time, and had to share the same public gallery with these people, which I found incredibly brave. But the presentation by Justice for Palestine didn't even talk about the conflict. And I think this was the key thing that shocked me, because I was ready to get up and give a big speech about the history since '48 and all of this nonsense that I barely knew anything about at the time. But the way that they framed their presentation was, I think it was called Get to Know Your Sister City or something like that, or Meet Your Sister City. And there were maybe a dozen slides of the streets of Ramallah. There was the festivals, the food festivals that were on. There was the jazz festival that had just been, it's the biggest one in the region. There were traditional Palestinian dishes, there were bits of the culture, and overall it was just the most beautiful, charming snapshot of a city living in such vibrancy despite the circumstances. And in fact, I don't even want to say despite the circumstances. I want to take that away, because the way it was presented to us was this really beautiful thing that most of us had. I think we have these kind of actually cartoonish ideas of what it must be like to live under occupation. I think we have these kind of Orwellian images of like gulag-style housing in our minds. And I think that is just swap. I know now, thanks to that presentation, that is simply not the case. And I think we think it's all grey and windswept, and of course that is not the case. It's a beautiful part of the world. And what that brought home for me was that people continue to exist and enjoy beauty despite the horrors of the settler regime that is literally on their doorstep. And the final conversation I had, which crystallized it for me, was when I was through, again, the efforts of J4P and the City Council talking to the Mayor of Ramallah. And I've told this yarn before, but for those of you who haven't heard it, he was talking about what it's like to live under occupation. He said it's not a soldier, it's not a tank, it's a weight on your mind that stops you from dreaming. And so he said to me that the most important thing for him as sort of an elected official in his role was to ensure that his people were dreaming and that his people were living for Palestine and not dying for Palestine. And so to me, that is the heart of what bravery is, I think, in an occupied society, is living for yourself, living for the people around you, celebrating beauty in all its forms, and defying the horrors that are literally right at the doorstep.
And also, seeing picture from Gaza before the genocide as well, even though there's wars in Gaza in a few years, but they rebuild it each time, and it looks beautiful pictures as well. I'll go back about inter-education again, as we talked about this. Like Indigenous people have no choice. It's like existing is a resistance, as he said. So actually, before UNRWA started operation after Nakba, all schools in Palestine stopped. But the first school was actually in Gaza, and it was in an old kitchen where they just told all the children and the neighbors that we're making a new school, and this is how they get their education. As well, another school was in Jordan, in one of the refugee camps, and that was even before UNRWA. And after UNRWA started operation, it was an agency for helping registered refugees. Like, it wasn't just about schools, but the refugees themselves who pushed the UNRWA to focus on schooling and education. So I remember my grandparents my grandpa shared a story with me. When he was young, he used to study in Yafa. And after Nakba, he stayed 3 years in a refugee camp. And in these 3 years, there were no school. And he used to study in the refugee camp with other teachers. And after he moved to, ended up in Nablus refugee camp, his older siblings did pay for him and for his other brother to complete his education, even though his brothers didn't go to school before or didn't get education. But this is their way of resisting the new situation. So they were refugee, no money, no schools. But when they got the chance and moved to Nablus city, their other siblings did pay for all of their schooling. And this is how my grandpa took his degree and his other brother.
Hilda, thank you. I had 2 other questions, but I'll leave that maybe towards the end of the time, and I'll open it up now for questions, comments, kōrero, whakaaro from the crowd. And please feel free to introduce yourself, say a little bit about where you're coming from with your question, and please address the group of presenters as a whole if you like, or you can address them individually. So yeah, I'll open it up now, and we have a solid half an hour for that.
No pressure.
I saw people studiously taking notes, so. Tangata?
Kia ora, ko Tangata toko ingoa, whakapapa to Pakistan and Aotearoa. And I just wanted to mahi to the panel for your awesome whakaaro. I really I was taking notes and felt like I was actually eating because it was just amazing. And particularly I wanted to mahi to you, Maya, because I think your storytelling is something that really brought each of your other whakaaro to light, and is something only Indigenous people know how to do, and you exemplified it beautifully. So, that's it.
Thank you so much for saying this. Actually, preparing for this panel was quite stressful and hard for me. I was like, I didn't have an idea what a panel looked like. So I was like, is it should I just tell information from Google or whatsoever? Or should I share my stories? But after talking with the other panels and with Faisal and with Claire, they told me that it's gonna be more meaningful if I shared my experiences. So I focused on my experiences and the stories from homeland than just some numbers and kind of information. So thanks for all of you and thanks for your messages. It's really meaningful to me.
Kia ora. I feel just so in awe of all 3 of you individually, but also as a panel is so beautiful, and everything weaves together so beautifully, which I think also is, and it's done so fluidly, but also feels natural, and I think that's what Indigenous solidarity is, right? It just is. And I think that you've shown that amazingly. But I want to touch on what you said, because I think that it would be really cool to hear from you that storytelling isn't only interesting and invokes the emotions, and humanising, which is one of the biggest things that Indigenous people have to fight against, is dehumanisation. But I think that I'm not sure if it would be for all Indigenous peoples, but I know for Palestinians and for Māoris, storytelling is a really powerful form of our way of life and also of resistance. So I wonder if maybe any of you would like to talk about that storytelling as Indigenous resistance.
I have a quick go. And I think one of the unique parts of Indigenous storytelling is it's revealed to you slowly. And I think what it was like for me, certainly growing up around whakapapa, just up in Whenua, is you are not handed the keys straight away. You can't search on Google to find the information that your uncles and aunties have. You can't ask a professor, you might have a slightly better chance. You can't even read old ethnography. It's all in your people. And it is a knowledge that, in my experience, they are a little bit guarded about, to be honest. It's not for everyone. It's, you prove that you're worthy of that knowledge in those stories that have been passed down and they're given to you. And I think what that reflects is a reluctance because of the way that our culture has been stripped from us in the process of colonization to share information that could be used against us. I recall I met a young knowledge keeper from the Squamish Nation from British Columbia in Canada, and he introduced himself to me as Dallas, as his first name. We talked for a few hours, and about 3 hours, and he said, actually, that's just not even my name. But he said, and the thing he said that I'll never forget is, but that's what I tell the Canadians. And I won't share his name here, but my point is, I think Indigenous storytelling has such powerful kernels of truth within it, and the slow, deliberate sharing of it is one of the most powerful tools that we have to preserve our culture in the way that we want and exercise sovereignty over our innermost traditions and knowledge and stories.
I think there's a few angles, I guess, on Indigenous storytelling that are interesting. I think one, just as like a rangatahi Māori in this day and age, is obviously because Māori come from like oral history traditions, we can like trust our own stories, like we can trust written histories, because that was often done by Pākehā. So you kind of have this like interesting balance of like research, and it's changing now. Like I have beautiful books of like full of Māori knowledge that's written by Māori people, like poetry and non-fiction knowledge and all those kinds of things. But I think there's like a certain truth in Indigenous stories in a way that maybe like non-Indigenous cultures don't understand truth. And I think the way our stories hold truth is that many different retellings or understandings of one thing can all be held as true. And I like to think about how much that like intensifies things and like removes conflict from things. So like holding different understandings and interpretations of like the same stories in instances, I think is really beautiful, and it's a really powerful part of being Indigenous. It's like holding other people's truths. I think it's something we like throw around a bit these days, like, oh, it's like whatever. But really, actually holding and respecting, other people's truths and their stories is like massive for like keeping our relationships well. And I think the next kind of part of that is relationship, and that through oral stories you must be in relationship with someone to hear them and to know them. Unlike knowledge that's written where we can just like consume at our own pace and our own rate however we want and like treat that how we want. With oral histories and storytelling, you have to be in relationship with people to hear it, and so I think you have a whole other depth of understanding of context, of place, of space, of like sacrifice, actually sitting and being with people, and trust that gets built when you share those. And so there's a goal, a value in oral histories and storytelling, I think, that we don't get by just like consuming knowledge in another way. But that would kind of be two of my takes on Indigenous storytelling.
Stories will make history alive. So, for example, I never visited Jaffa, but I can imagine Jaffa from my grandma's storytelling. She told me about the orange field and the city she lived in, and my other grandma, the city lived in Jaffa, and how the middle of the city looked like. Even though I never visited, and even though I know it's not like this anymore, Jaffa completely destroyed, and it's now called Tel Aviv as well. So even though I have no idea how Jaffa looked like, no picture, I have a picture in my head just from the storytelling from my grandma. So yeah.
Sorry, this is a bit selfish as well. I particularly was for you, Samaya. I had a question about spirituality and where Islam. I had a question about spirituality and like where Islam or being Muslim sits, because I know in Gaza, Palestinians and being Muslim is so big, but also the dehumanization of Palestinians because of Islamophobia. So I was wondering how you carry both those things, but also to the rest of the panelists, how you carry your spirituality and being Indigenous and how those two interlink.
I want to be honest with you. Seeing the Palestinians from Gaza and the way they believe in God, it's really so special, like no other Palestinian. I'm very honest, and I think this is one of the most touching thing about religious I've ever seen in my life. And just looking at them really change a lot in your, like, how you look at Palestine and the resistance in Palestine. I think I never felt that much of like feelings like with resistance the way I do feel now after seeing the people in Gaza and the lyrics for stuff.
I'm just going to let what's my sense that I don't want to contribute on top of that. But I think we can all learn a lot from the faith of God, whatever you believe. So maybe that's something you can think of.
Merhaba. Congratulations, because your stories and the way you tell are very touching. I'm curious to try to ask something critical from you, as Indigenous, what do you think we shouldn't have done to protect our roots, our culture, our tradition, and also what will be the best way to live in this world, regarding the fact that sometimes if you open up, you risk to be colonized, and then that creates kind of psychological wall in terms of protecting your story, your tradition, your cult, your way of drawing, your way of telling stories, and at the same time how it can be a border, because if we don't try to live all together and to mix up in a melting pot or in a Pandora vase, we don't want to survive in any case. So I know it's a very critical point, and I don't know if you have the answer, but if yourself you ever been critical on what's happening, or each stories, what we should have done, what we shouldn't.
Jeez. Yeah, I think one, that second part of your question around how we engage and like how we engage safely, that's kind of what I'm hearing. Like as Indigenous peoples, not saying like insular, but engaging with the outside world, non-Indigenous people or culture safely. I think that's a hugely difficult question. I think we see it like playing out in a lot of different spheres right now. Like for me in the legal world, like issues like intellectual property and art and language and those sorts of things like materialize in the legal sphere all the time because people are like trying to walk that tightrope of here's something that we have to offer, or here's a part of who we are, and it's quite unsafe for that to exist just like out there publicly. And again, in the legal space, we're seeing more and more incorporation of Māori customary law, of tikanga, into our colonial legal system. And like that's really unsafe. But it's also an opportunity for Māori to have a different experience in an unjust justice system. So there's this really challenging dance, I think, that Indigenous people and culture are always playing with knowledge, customary law, art, culture, language, whatever it is, on that point. So I think it's so tricky, and like I don't know if I have all the answers, and if I did, I think that would be great and we'd be in a really different position. So that's probably normal, but I do think that's something that we constantly have to wānanga, to discuss and to talk about and to really critically analyse when we do things or when we take action or when we decide something, is like thinking about the consequences of if we don't do X, what will happen, and if we do it, what will happen, because I think those consequences sit really heavily on both sides. So that's probably a really unsatisfactory answer, but I think that's how I think about it. And I think it's something Indigenous peoples think about all the time. Or the people that I move in the same circle as, particularly for Māori in the legal profession, constantly talking about, researching, discussing. So yeah, it's hard, but important conversation.
Actually, if I could, okay, if I could add to that, because I think that's really true, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative, and Tom, who's the head of the Canterbury version of this Socialist Society, gets very cross at me for expressing this viewpoint. But I'm something of a treaty originalist. And what I mean by that is, I'm obviously referring to the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. And what I mean by that is, I understand the treaty as it was written with the intent of the people who signed it. The treaty does not say put Māori wards on local councils. The treaty does not say your pepeha when you stand up in your corporate board meeting. The treaty does not say go to reo classes. The treaty is very explicitly about shared sovereignty and just two distinct nations learning to live together on the same family. And it's a challenging view, right? Because we exist in this hegemonic sort of capitalist system, and well-meaning people do the best they can with these things that I'm describing. As you very rightly pointed out, we try to abstract the treaty by doing things like putting tikanga into our legislation and embedding the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in different policies. The treaty does not ask us to do that. The treaty is actually very, very simple. There are only 4 articles, well, 3 of the articles. But unfortunately, the simplicity of the treaty is both its greatest strength, but because it's its greatest strength, it's also its greatest challenge and therefore weakness, because it threatens the colonial state in a very fundamental way, because the colonial state does not share power. And that is fundamentally what the treaty is about, is sharing power. It's not about, bringing a little bit of modification into your neoliberal capitalist hellscape. It is genuinely about devolving power to hapu specifically, but iwi, more generally, and unfortunately, ESG later. And this is a very challenging thing to do. We live in a country where Parliament is sovereign, and the sovereign is sovereign, and the sovereign is not our sovereign. So, I guess when you ask what should we have done, I would say we should have honoured the treaty in the 1860s before we killed a bunch of Maoris in the Waikato.
not sure if I'm answering your question, like my, yeah, anyway, so I think as a result of just living in occupation, I believe that we can't separate how our thoughts become like our vision when we're people who lived under occupation. So I believe that we should just express what we think, like arts, writing, or whatsoever. And it's so normal to not be able to separate them because, like, occupation really affects each part of your life, like your brain, your education, your home, your family, your past, your present, and your future. So I think we should just go with the thing that we believe we can do and express them as much as possible. Yeah.
Is it okay, you didn't, sorry Faisal, you did invite, the Palestinians are popping off tonight, you did invite a bit of audience participation, but I just wanted to share a brief whakaro because I thought your question was really good, because I think it strikes to the heart of the tensions that sometimes it's so hard for us to navigate. So I'm a Palestinian, but I guess like sometimes what it's hard for us to get into the muck of, and I think maybe this is what you were getting at with the vacuum question a little bit, Faisal, is that being colonised and living under capitalism puts us in situations where we are up against the wall with the gun, maybe figuratively, metaphorically, literally against it, like here, in terms of the choices that we're able to make. And I think, you know, Palestinians living under the West Bank have really had those experiences, but I also think that, yeah, I believe that sometimes we get pushed into a corner. And I think that, I don't think it's to say that any people, you know, I think sometimes, and I think I can say this here, I think sometimes we start speaking about things in these really moralistic or essentialized terms where we're like, oh, Pākehā are like this, and Palestinians are like this, and Indigenous people are like this. And structurally, you know, these things are correct, they represent truth, but the reality is always much messier. The reality is always much more complicated. Like we have, you know, within any culture, you have people who uphold racist ideologies. You have people who uphold structures of power that oppress us. And to me, it's like we have to get rid of these ideas because the ideas are the ideas of capitalism, the structures of capitalism, the structures of colonisation are what prevent us from having an openness with each other. And what prevent us from, and not to say that our systems before that were always perfect, but, you know, people in historical Palestine did live alongside each other with an openness. Māori were very open when Pākehā arrived here, and in good faith were like, yeah, we can, you know, like in signing to Tiriti were like, yeah, we can do this. But it's only the ideas of colonisation and capitalism that can only see people as something to be exploited, extracted, and the land as something to be owned privately. And these are ideas that are embedded in colonial capitalism that must be destroyed, no matter who they exist in. And I think that's the global fight we're in. And so I think that we should embrace there's a complexity to it, and the places that it will come from will look different, the faces that it will come from will look different, but there is a more open, communal way of relating to ourselves and each other that I would say often Indigenous people embody, but not always. But as long as the structures exist, the architecture of those structures will fall on all of us to compete, to have a scarcity mindset, to fall into all these traps, and to trade away as well on our rights to sort of achieve things. But there is something better there, but we have to recognise it's not like kind of, I know that people get this, but it's not those essentialised terms of like this race versus this face. Like if you think about ideas like imperialism and colonisation, like we often talk about European imperialism and colonisation, but China, you know, there are other nations that participate in colonisation as well. And so it's useful for us to recognise that it's the structures that are the problem. and that those structures can transform and take new shape. And so we must be really vigilant about what racism looks like, what colonisation looks like, and capitalism looks like, wherever we see it. And it's only when we can kind of overcome that I think we can be really open with each other. I think we know how to do that, but I think this architecture doesn't let us. That's my whakapapa on that.
I kind of have something to add on to that, but also relating it back to the spirituality that we mentioned earlier. I think, obviously I'm coming from the place of a Muslim, but I think this is where like the idea of religion and God can come into those dismantling of structures, because I think when you think of religion as more than a relationship with God, but also a set of rules and a lifestyle to follow, that's what we can start to imagine these different structures coming in. And that's not to say that one religious idea is the answer to all peoples living in a space, but I think bringing in that lens of spirituality which exists in a lot of Indigenous cultures is where you can start to imagine the way society can look outside of these capitalist structures, which are very convenient. Okay.
It was interesting when Natalie was talking about architecture and structure, because that brings to mind something that's very fixed. And that connected to what Ellie, you said earlier about the fixed nature of writing down and how you felt that there was a truth through an oral telling. And that, I was then thinking about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but actually primarily the Treaty of Waitangi and the comparison between that and the Balfour Declaration as two fixed documents that actually I feel more and more are direct parallels, given that they were fixed without the participation of the people about which whom they were referring. But we are also still working, as Nika was saying, with something also fixed. Te Tiriti o Waitangi was written down. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. I just thought there was a really exciting set of connections of a variety of things, of both this trying to work out how do we hold to the truth of something that's fixed, which as a Pākehā is absolutely my go-to. Everything has to be written down, it's very important. I have notebooks upon notebooks, and that just makes my to-do list more formal. So we have that cultural thing, that feeling that because it's written down it has a formality, and yet Māori had this incredible diplomacy to be able to come to the table and work in another cultural frame with something that was fixed, even though perhaps there was the sense that more truth is within the oral storytelling realm. So I apologize, it's like a lot of thinking that I was just doing there. I don't know if you have any thoughts about those documents or about the nature of working with something that was fixed even though it wasn't culturally true necessarily.
I think there's a few things there. There's more than a few, but a few that spring to mind. I think one is the fixed nature of Te Tiriti, the treaty, and how that sits with Māori cultural traditions of storytelling and oral histories. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a tradition, right? Like it's not. I don't think we can look back and go like, oh yeah. I mean, on one lens, we can go, yeah, look, it was written down. If everyone just stuck to it, if it was respected and honoured, we wouldn't be in this position. So that's one lens, right? Like just very basically, not the writtenness is not necessarily the lack of respect. Like the sheer will of the coloniser to just take and take and take and take. So I think that's one part of it, right? And the British, I don't think a single treaty they engaged in with any Indigenous people was ever upheld. So we're seeing like this sort of kind of systemic political issue, right, with those dishonesty kind of there. And then but I also think like what we then have to do when we engage with Te Tiriti is engage with the way Māori would have been having those conversations or engaging with those conversations with their understanding or our understanding of how those conversations are undertaken, and then look at, okay, what does this actually mean then? Because it's the whole outer context document, right? Or we just look at it as these, like, what do these 4 paragraphs say, 3.5, you know, and go, okay, cool, this equals this, and this is where the Crown went wrong, and all those things. But like, what's actually talked about in the treaty, and some of that English translation, is completely incompatible with Māori conceptions of the world, of land, of, like, you know, we're talking about things like mana, sovereignty, authority. So, yeah, I think it's really tricky to, like, talk about, you know, the written and the storytelling and all these things when we're dealing with this, like, way of engaging with Indigenous people that sits so far outside of the context in which things are done. And that's where I think a lot of that mistranslation, miscommunication happened. I also think we don't want to blame that alone, because, you know, we have to hold this kind of like dishonesty and intentional kind of breaching and taking, you know, in that kind of generosity relationship. So I don't know if that's even answering your question, but I think there are the things that I reflect on or come to mind when you talk about like the written document. In terms of the Balfour Declaration, I think I wouldn't want to speak on like Palestinian understandings of history, because that's not my story. But yeah, I can see the parallels there, kind of between those two spaces, and the role, you know, historically that the British held in that. There's a whole lot of historical point along there that I think is really interesting. But yeah, I think it's messy, you know, when we're looking at that context and the cultural context of those conversations, and then also, yeah, what manifested and then what played out afterwards. So that would be my like unsatisfactory answer on that.
Okay, I can see our lovely moderator looking at the time, but I will very quickly just insert my own whakapapa. The first thing is that Pāmoa was evoked before, so I think it's only right that I probably say the last thing tonight from my own half of the table, by starting with him. And he said, I was reading just a little earlier for other reasons, I just recreationally reading Moana Jackson. This is the part of life I'm about. And he says that the chief evidence for the ongoing status of colonisation is the constant reinterpretation of the treaty and the constant reinterpretation of our history. And this is a little bit why I kind of say that I'm an unashamed treaty essentialist, because I think that it's sort of become trendy for both sides, if there is such a thing as sides of the treaty debate, to reinterpret it with their own contemporary lens on what they would quite like it to mean. And I think what it does is it doesn't give our tupuna the credit that they deserve. They were very skilled political operators, as were the chieftains and nobles of all Indigenous peoples around the world who signed treaties with colonising powers, from Africa to the Americas to the Pacific. Everywhere that a treaty was signed, I think we do a disservice to those leaders of the past by presuming that they weren't capable of understanding what they were signing. I think they were perfectly capable of understanding what they were signing, but I think what was written, and deliberately so, existed to obfuscate their understandings and those verbal understandings between parties, which would have underpinned their understandings of the treaties they were signing. So I guess for me, it is always about, when you're looking at treaties between a colonising power and an Indigenous power, yes, you always have to look at the Indigenous version, under international law, but I think even more than that, you have to look at the Indigenous intention and the Indigenous understanding, because that to me is the valid version of the treaty, whether it's written down or not.
What they did say is enough. And if I'm going to talk about Palestine and the Balfour thing, so the Balfour Declaration actually was, like, Palestinians weren't in the picture, like, anyway, so it was done and made and talked between people of Palestine. Palestinians weren't in the picture, so there's some similarity how the colonizers always have one goal in writing these things, but, different way. So there is this way, and in both ways that the Palestinian even didn't participate in that thing. So yes.
Thank you. Can I invite maybe I'll give it just a couple of minutes for any final questions or comments.
Kia ora, this is really, not really a question, but for Wahine from Palestine. Don't be whakama or shy when you talk to the people about your people. I don't know, really, I just have to say, when my people come from really courageous stock, and what the Palestinians have been through, fucking unbelievable, you know, just, it knocks me when I see the suffering, and it's ongoing, not from just 10 months, but from decades and decades, eh? My heart is for the Palestinians, for sure, and I just want to really honour them in the humblest way, because I feel really deeply about how much they've been pushed aside, and the lies and lies, you know, that they've had to endure. So much pain. I really feel that because of what has happened to mine. Anyway, I just wanted to honour them, and so all Palestinians, you know. There's some people like me out there. There's not enough Māori, I believe, that are behind us. I want more of my own, because there's so many parallels. These things to you all. I don't know what else to say, but a lot of us are behind you.
I think perhaps we'll wrap it up there. I want to give a big thank you, big gratitude to our speakers and all the cordial and everything you've shared, and to everyone here actually. So I'm just going to skip the whole final round of applause. We're all still here, we're all friends, and we're going to keep the conversation going. But I will pass it over to Claire, who has some pānui before we do the ending cover here.
Yes, I do have some pānui. I would also like to say thank you. You were wonderful. I thought Basil did a really great job at moderating for somebody who had no idea. It was a really wonderful evening, and I'd just like to join in on what Ella said, and particularly for my Pākehā whānau here, let's throw down the riddle and have the courage to have the conversations that need to be had. And yes, I think that's enough. On pānui, I wanted to just share that there are a couple of WSS events that are coming up. There's a Labour Weekend conference, and then I've got to do the glasses again, I keep forgetting, it's terrible. And then there is also a discussion panel coming up on the 13th of August. Hope to see you all at the rally tomorrow regarding the ICJ rulings. It would be wonderful to see you there. And Ella, thank you for offering to do a presentation here. Thank you to you all for coming.
Mea karakia tātou, kia tauranga manaakitanga o te mea ngaro, ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Te mahi a te hua mā kihiki, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi ngā iwi take, tuturua whiti whakamaua kia tēnā. Haumi e hui e. Tai ki e.